It is a spiritual marriage. Now, what's a spiritual marriage mean? Again, this has nothing to do with sex. It is a commitment between you and the teacher to work as intensely as possible for your liberation. That's the marriage vow. So there has to be someone who's willing to go there with you, even if it's, they say, kind of distant and away, but they're there, they're committed, and they're going to do what's needed for your awakening. That's their commitment. And your commitment is to do whatever you need to do for that awakening, using the teacher as a guide.
Namaste. You're listening to the Savannah Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SavannahSpirit.com, the best place to shop for unique clothing, spiritual handcrafted jewelry, healing gemstones, and fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now, here's your host, Brett Larkin.
Hello, Savannah family. Welcome back to the show. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And this episode is a continuation. It's part 2 of our fascinating conversation about Shaktipat and Kundalini Awakening. So if you haven't listened to Tuesday's episode, the episode right before this one, make sure to do that. We talk about what Shaktipat is, what role does it play in the process of liberation, how is it that it's transmitted down from student to teacher. And in this episode, we're going deeper. We're going to discuss, once you experience a Kundalini awakening, how does that actually unfold throughout your system and the upper chakras. We're going to learn about how this Kundalini energy can thrive or die, depending on how we choose to nurture it. We're also going to deep dive and discuss the relationship between teacher and student. Is it possible to experience a Kundalini awakening without the guidance of a spiritual teacher, or is direct energy transmission from a teacher really necessary? What red flags should we be aware of when we're looking for this teacher, when we're looking to receive Shaktipat? Here to talk to us about all of these things today is Gabriel Cousens. He's the author of 14 internationally acclaimed books. He's known worldwide as a spiritual teacher and the leading expert in live plant source nutrition. He's a holistic physician, a psychiatrist, a family therapist. He holds an MD from Columbia Medical School, a doctorate in homeopathy, and diplomas in Ayurveda, clinical acupuncture, and holistic medicine. His knowledge on all things Kundalini is vast, so buckle up as we continue Tuesday's conversation. Before we jump back into the conversation, I just want to remind you that the best way to keep these interviews coming to you and to support the podcast is by making a purchase on SavannahSpirit.com, and you can use that code podcast30 for 30% off your first order. The product I'm featuring and highlighting today is the Savannah Spirit prayer wheels. This concept of a prayer wheel was inspired by the method of Buddha's teaching, turning the wheel of Dharma. And Dharma in Buddhism means law and order. In other words, the laws of the universe. These prayer wheels are found throughout Tibetan culture, and it's believed that as the wheel is spun, the practitioner is gaining wisdom and destroying negative karma, thereby progressing along their spiritual path. So if that's something you're interested or want to explore bringing into your home practice, explore Savannah Spirit's prayer wheels, and remember there are so many amazing products designed to help your yoga and meditation practice at SavannahSpirit.com, and you're going to want to use that code podcast30 for 30% off your first order. All right, now let's get back into our conversation with Gabriel. So again, forgive me if I'm getting too technical, but does that mean that in order to get to these 3 elevated states of samadhi, that a Kundalini awakening is required?
Well, I'll never want to say required because you never know what's going on, okay? But what I'd say is it's pretty common that prior to that, because this is like 2 years later, 3 years later after the awakening, as it progresses within you, that these things for me begin to happen, besides the initial Shaktipat. And in that, I got my assignment, which is you should learn to eat and live in a way that supports the Kundalini awakening. That's how I got into spiritual nutrition. From that assignment on that, the voice rang out. So I was getting messages. I was going to nothing. I was having visions. I was having a lot of things going on. But generally speaking, At the level of samadhi I'm talking about, I've only heard about that from people who already have the Kundalini awaken. So I'll say that. And I see in the Kundalini Crisis Clinic, I'll see Buddhists and I'll see, Zen meditators, because it's not exactly written in their system that this is supposed to happen. Then they start having kriyas where they're moving around and the master's sitting over your head because, you're moving around. You're supposed to be sitting still, but the energy's moving. And I want to emphasize the idea of the energy moving because it's unwinding you so the Kundalini can best flow. That's where you got the yoga asanas, that's where you get the pranayama, because it begins reorganizing you on the physical and emotional and mental and also cellular level so this Kundalini energy can do its job of taking you to liberation. So we kind of see it that way. So what I'm saying is more in my 45 years of experience with this, it's like, yeah, I think it does to go to these deeper levels of samadhi. Can you get a quiet mind bending? Of course, but I'm not calling that samadhi because there's still a you and noticing you have a quiet mind. Does that kind of help answer that?
It does. And I think my next question, or what I'd love to hear you talk about, is we're talking about Kundalini awakening. And I think people have this visual of, right, that serpentine energy moving up the spine and through the chakras. And in the case that you've shared, right, this is a huge awakening with actual physical, stigmata, right? What happens after that? Does the Kundalini recoil and go back to, live and habitate at the base of the spine so you can go make breakfast and do all the other things you need to do? Or once it's awakened forever and that's how you're passing it to other people?
Okay, that's a great question. So I'm going to answer it again based on my experience is, okay, for the first 3 days after this, I could barely move. It was very intense, okay? Then things start to come into integration, but it's just started its work. So it begins to progress throughout your system. So as I write in my book on the spiritual nutrition, I talk about how you have 3 knots, and one is kind of near the base, but it's more I'm going to say sexual knot, and there's certain things that happen there. Now, how do I know? Because it happened to me, okay? And then there's a heart knot. And again, I'm not using the technical terms here. And then finally, there's a third eye knot. Now, each of those requires another level of the Kundalini. So you have prana, and then they call it chit, which is more heart, another level of intensity, and Kundalini, okay? So those are the 3 levels. And then above that, third eye, then there's a whole other thing that happens. So it's a constant unfolding. And the idea of feeding the Kundalini is living in a way that supports it. In yoga terms, we call it sanatana dharma, the natural way of living that takes you to liberation. So, for me, that includes yoga asana, includes pranayama, it includes yoga asana, of course. It also includes service and charity, and also includes generally working with a spiritual teacher and doing Vega and Viveka. Are you familiar with the word Vega?
I am, yes, but please define it and tell our listeners just in case they don't know.
So Vega is what we call equal vision. It's seeing the spark of the divine in everyone, that we're all equal souls. We may have different levels of responsibility, but in the inner world, we're all equal souls. And Viveka is the ability to tell the difference between the temporal reality and the cosmic reality and be able to balance those in your life. So that's what goes on. Then another step is, prayer and meditation, and also mantra repetition, and then as much Shaktipat as possible. So all these things build and move the energy. So it has to be fed. I've had people come to me and they had Kundalini Awaken 30 years ago, but they didn't do the work and they were in great regret. And so they'll come to meditation and, it will get reactivated. Now, was it just lighten or did it go to sleep? I can't make that judgment. But generally speaking, once it's awakened, it keeps moving if you're doing what I just mentioned. I call it the 6 foundations, that you're in Sanatana Dharma, that continues to have that unfoldment for yourself. Okay, you're continually, upping the energy, helping unfold, because really a lot of things go on. You burn up a lot of samskaras almost initially, because it's moving up the Sushumna, where the samskaras, at least in my yoga tradition, have it stored. You're straightening things out actually on your physical body. There's a great upgrade that way. And then you face more and more spiritual kind of unfolding and tests. So it's working physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual plane continually, but you have to be in Sanatana Dharma. I don't want to say you have to, but if you're in Sanatana Dharma, then you're going to be optimally feeding it on all the levels. And that's the way I would say it. So you can't just run, okay, I'm going to get Shaktipat today, and that's it. No, you have to really, that's when the work begins.
Yeah, it sounds like it's like this flame that's awakened inside you, but it's like just like you tend to a fire, like you have to nurture it.
And you have to feed it. It has to, and all these practices, which include the pranayama, which include yoga asana, but a lot more, I'm going to say more emphasis for me is with meditation. It drove me to have to meditate 6 hours a day. I didn't really have a choice. And I was chanting 4.5 hours. And I did this for 7 years until that, I was acknowledged. I wasn't going anywhere. And that's the point I want to say. Goal limits you because it's an ego thing. So for me, and I'm going to say a little naive, but maybe that was good, I didn't have a goal. I get up at 2 a.m. every day, and we do what we're doing and do my Shiva puja with the little Shiva temple, and I would do this, and then I off meditating, then we'd be chanting for an hour and a half. And then I was just showing up, having the courage to show up as I was feeling it was pushing me to the limit, and I was just willing to stay with it the whole time. So there was no goal. It was, maybe just surviving it, but there's no, I'm going to do this so I'll be enlightened. It really wasn't honestly wasn't in my mind. It was, here's the process. Can I keep up with it?
Right. And the way you're describing it, it sounds like once you have a Kundalini awakening, it's almost like a full-time job to tend to it. And I mean, to do the amount of practice you're describing. Has that been your experience, or is this something that someone could continue to nurture? Say they have a Kundalini awakening, but they could continue to nurture and sort of tend to that flame as we're talking about it, and also, go to an office job or, be part of like.
Yeah, I mean, I was also working as a holistic physician. This is in India, but also here in the U.S., back and forth, about 4.5 hours a day. So it didn't incapacitate me in any, for the first few days, yes. But besides the first few days, no. Because you just become part of the cosmic flow. Everything gets easier to do. You're doing your work, whatever it is. To me, as a holistic physician, fine, I'm doing that. Fine, I'm dealing with people having Kundalini crisis. Fine. You're just part of the flow. So you become more effective. You don't become, unless you have some real mental problem with it, you really don't become dysfunctional. It's just the opposite. You become more functional.
And do you still, in your experience, it requires practicing a long amount of time a day? Like you said, you were sort of driven to chant and driven to do these things, or can it be a short, effective practice? Like, what does your practice look like right now, your personal practice?
Well, let me ask the question, then so it's going to move you at different times. Then it was 6 hours of meditation, 4.5 hours of chanting. I'm also a householder, so, I have my kids, time for relationship. Also working 4.5 hours as a holistic physician. You had to be pretty well organized to pull that off. So it doesn't take you away from your life. It deepens your life. So I was on the intense path. Maybe that's my style. Whatever it is, that's what was happening. You can also have a moderate or mild path where it's there and you're doing your yoga asana hour a day or whatever you're doing. And you know what I mean? You're doing your service in different ways. So people have different paths according to their destiny. I'm going to put it that way. I just knew it was my destiny. I had to be doing that, period. And if you aren't driven that way, that's fine. It's still unfolding. And everybody has their time. So it's not like you can technique your way to enlightenment. And maybe that helps here. Sanatana Dharma is just being lived by the Kundalini, being lived by the natural way of living that takes you to liberation. And it guides you. So that's what I'm saying. There isn't exactly a rule book on this. You have to follow how your inner guidance is. So for some people, they're going to do, an hour meditation day, and they're going to be doing this, and we'll do some yoga. I'm working an office job. I have my family. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's going to vary according to the person and according to, I'm going to say, your destiny. Okay. And I wasn't thinking about destiny. Honestly, I was just trying to keep up with this divine energy unfolding. I clearly knew it was a divine energy. My job, as I framed it, was, let me see if I can keep up with this. Does that make sense, what I just said?
It does. And Gabriel, I'd love to hear you tell us about finding the right teacher, because when we look at yoga as a whole right now, in America at least, people go to a studio and they may or may not practice with a particular teacher that they have a close relationship with. They may be intimidated to even connect on a deeper level with a teacher. We're kind of all just practicing on our mats together, but there's not that. And again, I don't want to say it's like it has to be an intimate connection, because as you said, like you were in a room with 1,000 people and your teacher gave you this transmission. But what advice do you have?
And I hadn't even hardly met him.
Yeah, exactly. So what advice do you have for people? Or I guess the question is really like, do you think in order to have an awakening or in order to progress the way we need to progress, does there need to be a teacher who helps us? Like, can we do this on our own? Do we need a teacher? And if so, how do we find the right person? Okay,
so my first answer is I think everyone ultimately needs a teacher at a certain time in their evolution, because it not only does it make it easier, but there's certain things like getting Shaktipat, like being somewhat directed, helps a tremendous amount. I can talk from my experiences is that this was really beyond my background, so to speak. So having a teacher guide and listen and point out areas of unfoldment, even though I actually didn't have that a personal, real person relationship, but still, I would listen to them every day, and I would sit and, silence with them. So the role of a teacher is very, very important on that general energetic level. Now, in the enlightenment thing, and I'm going to, that's a whole other level. So having an enlightened teacher, if that's what your point is, clearly you need that. So when you say, well, what's the criteria? Well, you need somebody who's I'm going to use the word acknowledged, liberated. That's very specific. In other words, I've been acknowledged by two different gurus who were liberated. Fine, and I picked someone because I knew in my heart there was something about that who had been acknowledged by his guru as liberated. You see where I'm saying here? So it just depends what you want. Now, if you want a yoga asana teacher, then you want your best teacher. But if you're talking about liberation, you're talking about a different set of criteria. So because you can teach yoga asana, has nothing to do with liberation, if that makes sense. If we're looking for liberation, then you need to find someone who is there, who's acknowledged, and then knows all the potholes along the way. Without creating any fear about it, there are many dead bodies along the way, because you can, when you're dealing at this level, you really can get off and really get confused and really damage your spiritual life. So having someone to guide you is very important. You have to do the work. They don't do the work for you. In our tradition, there is another step to this, and that will partly answer your question. There is a step once we go to Kundalini from the third eye. Once that's open, there's a final step which does require the role of the spiritual teacher, which is to pull the energy from there up through the crown. Okay. And I was at this place where there's another kind of a chakra in between called Akata triangle. And I was having visions of Kameshwara and Kameshwara in this triangle. And when you hit that, then you're tasting the golden nectar. All this is going on. I know more is going on. And I'm not, say that, on a talking real relationship with Muktananda at all. And I'm thinking, well, how is this going to happen? So I'm in my usual 2-hour noon meditation, where we lived. And suddenly I got a message, go to this particular place, which is the a little indoor courtyard outside of Muktanada's room. Okay, I don't know. I'm going to do that. And I go there, I sit down, and he comes out of his door, comes over to me and begins moving the energy from above the third eye up through this final phase of the Kundalini. And once it pops, which is needed for liberation, he just turns around and goes away. Well, he doesn't say anything to me, but clearly he did the last step. Now, I didn't ask. Do you understand what I'm saying? So there's a role there that the enlightened spiritual teacher can play that's way beyond giving you some knowledge. And the teacher does help you give, obviously get knowledge. And you study the Vedas, you study this, gives you different insights, helps you for Reiki and Vega and all those subtleties, because they can kind of look behind you metaphorically and let you know where your holes are, where you need to work on yourself, because you don't see those holes. Nobody does. So there is a role for that level of teacher, but there's a role for the teacher in the enlightenment process that where the final kind of stuff happens. Now, are there exceptions? Yes, there are. But generally speaking, now I'm giving you a kind of classic understanding of it and my own direct experience. Does that help? Now I'm going to just say that's not the same as learning yoga asana. Well, you do need a teacher for that too. I mean, it's like, well, you want to learn to play the piano? Well, you can figure it out on your own, or you can have an expert teacher, and that speeds up the process. So there isn't, in my opinion, there is a role for teachers at all the different levels.
What advice do you have for people who are interested in the kind of teacher we're talking about today? Maybe they have a very strong yoga asana and meditation practice, and they're excited about all of this. They're ready for the next step, but they don't know where to turn. Should they be maybe setting an intention, or what advice do you have for them to get connected to the right person?
What I would say, because there has to be some kind of chemistry there, okay? I had been actually looking for a teacher over a period of time, just because I knew that was important in my own kind of intuition. And you go to this one, no, he's not liberated. And you go to this one, and no, that person, she isn't really ready, to do do you see what I mean? So you have to do some shopping. Then there has to be a certain amount of chemistry. Now, I don't mean sexual chemistry, all that gets mixed up. I'm not talking about that. But it is a spiritual marriage. Now, what's a spiritual marriage mean? Again, this has nothing to do with sex. It is a commitment between you and the teacher to work as intensely as possible for your liberation. That's the marriage vow. So there has to be someone who's willing to go there with you, even if it's, they say, kind of distant and away, but they're there, they're committed, and they're going to do what's needed for your awakening. That's their commitment, and your commitment is to do whatever you need to do for that awakening, using the teacher as a guide. So those are your kind of the spiritual marriage in terms of the liberation process. Is that different than going to someone learning yoga? Yeah, it is, because people have their styles. And hey, does this fit? Do I like this style? Do I like the flowing thing like my wife and I now do? Because she became my yoga teacher. The tri-yoga system, that works for me. It's flowing, and it organizes the neurology, and it does a lot of things. Do you see what I'm saying? So that's more individual. Other people like this style. People like this style. In the same way, when you're talking about a spiritual teacher involved in the liberation process, got to have the chemistry, and it has to fit in some way. You have to feel comfortable with your teacher.
Are there any red flags that you think people should look out for? For example, you talked a little bit about how this is not a sexual relationship. Are there things like that, whether it's payment or saying that there's going to be some sort of transmission through sex, that are these things could you tell us basically some red flags that we should look out for?
I may be a little traditional, but to me, that really, the whole sexual thing is really out of line. And there are a lot of reasons why that's out of line. But I would say if that's going on, that's a huge red flag. Any sort of exploitation, sexual being one of them, is, takes it out of line. So there has to be a contract where you're doing what you're doing Yeah, okay, so there's some payment. You got to pay to go to an intensive. You just see what I mean? But that's kind of in a conscious contract. We're not talking about exploitation. Should it be for free? Well, I don't think traditionally it's for free. You go to the guru traditionally and you work 12 years, well, your labor counts. That wasn't for free, even though you didn't pass money. So there has to be some sort of energy exchange. It's kind of the rules of the universe, so to speak, in my point of view. It doesn't have to be money, but there has to be an exchange of energy. I think that's part of how the overall system, and I'm not just talking about guru disciple, but in general in the world, how that works. So I'll put it that way. And crossing the boundaries, like the sexual thing, really is a super red flag. Exploitation, where you're feeling exploited in an obvious way, that's a red flag. That's how I would look at it. You want the chemistry, which is a positive psychospiritual chemistry, and again, not sexual chemistry, and some level of commitment.
And in terms of the level of commitment, and if someone was interested in approaching a teacher about having this kind of relationship, do you have any? I don't know. It's interesting because it seems like such a personal relationship, right? You're calling it a spiritual marriage. Yet at the same time, your experiences was that there were 1,000 other people around you when this was happening, right?
And it was intensely personal. How many people do you know come up and blow into your mouth and you're taking on their energy? I mean, that's pretty personal. Do you follow me? I was willing to take his, we'll say Shakti into myself and let it work on me. Takes a lot of trust. And again, it's very personal. Okay. Did I spend time talking with it? Not really. I wasn't a Swami, and the Swamis had a little bit more priority. I was a householder and am a householder. But I was allowed to stand, in the line with the Swamis near him when he was doing darshan. Do you see what I'm saying?
Well, it sounds like you really trusted him, and that element of trust would be very important for any of this to unfold correctly.
That's a nice way of phrasing it. There has to be that trust. I didn't think about it that way, honestly. I was there, but that trust is inherent. So there has to be some real trust in the relationship. To me, the spiritual marriage is the trust. They are really committed to your liberation. Okay, not everybody's committed. Not every teacher is committed to your personal liberation. But to me, that's part of the spiritual marriage. That's your marriage vow. So there has to be trust in those vows, whether you say it overtly or not.
That makes a lot of sense. Gabriel, as we wrap up our time together, I want to make sure people know. So how can they get connected and find you, whether it's online, or what's the best way if they want to connect with you more around what we've talked about here today?
Well, they can go to drcousens.com. That's my website. Teaching in different places around the country. I do teach in the Bay Area twice a year. And once they get hooked in, there's a schedule. I'll be in New York. I'll be in Florida. I'm trying to limit it to like 4 places here. I'm in Brazil. I'm in Europe. I'm in Israel. I'm in a variety of places. So once they're hooked into the schedule, this is what people do. Okay. And they'll come to some point, particularly when they know I'm giving Shaktipat, and, make that connection. That's how I would say that's the most real way. There needs to be some in-person connection at some point in the story. Even if it's once, it does make a difference. So go to drcousens.com, look up the schedule, see where there's a potential interface. Because a lot of people come and they just want to get that Shakti and Shaktipat, and that's fine. And then they continue. I don't do like a list of disciples, and that's not the way I do it. It's just like, I'm there. This is what I'm supposed to do, and you're welcome to come drink at the fountain.
I'll make sure to put all those links below so people can find you. And I just want to follow up on something you said that I thought was interesting, was that coming in person is important, because I know you said before that this can be transmitted with like a look or a gaze, right? And when we were talking about like red flags, would that be another red flag for people if someone was like, we can just do this over Skype? Like, is that, do you know what I'm saying? Like through video conference, is that?
Okay, so I give you an example how it works. So in a week or two, I'm going to Brazil. Now, their groups, because my students are there, I will give their group Shaktipat, They will get Kundalini work, but they're also going to meet with me. You see what I mean? I'm and that's part of it. So, but we don't want to limit it to a Skype interaction, although we can do those things. There needs to be this personal connection at some level. Now, that's just my belief system, okay? You can have gurus who have left their body and they're still carrying a certain amount of connection energy. So I don't want to limit it, but I believe there's some power to the living in-person spiritual teacher that's different than your fantasy of someone who's left the body, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. Before we close, is there any last words of advice that you have for our listeners who are hoping to awaken Kundalini energy in their body and start walking towards this path of liberation?
I think the most important advice I can give to have that really heartfelt commitment to participate in the liberation process, beginning the process of, I'm going to say, Sanatana Dharma, the natural way of living that leads you to liberation, and somewhere along the line, finding a teacher, even if it's for one time, where this energy can be awakened.
And when you say a heartfelt commitment, just because I want to really drill down for folks, does that look like a daily yoga practice, a daily meditation practice, maybe a certain type of diet? Is that what you're talking about?
Well, that's certainly the kind of foundation level. I mean, if you're not doing yoga sun every day and you're not really meditating and you're not doing the pranayama, for me, in terms of eating, it really needs to be an ahimsa diet, which is at least a vegan diet. Those are like foundations. The yogic teachings really don't support eating death. Lots and lots of quotes. So it is a commitment to live a sattvic lifestyle, which is, again, takes you away from eating meat, fish, chicken, and dairy. So even though in the past dairy was part of the sattvic lifestyle, it's not the same. That takes us another discussion. But it's a whole lifestyle. The Sanatana Dharma is the lifestyle that supports you becoming a superconductor of the divine. I'll put it that way. And so may everyone be blessed that you have the courage to make that choice in your life to move into Sanatana Dharma and move towards being a superconductor of the divine and meet awakened spiritual teacher or liberated spiritual teacher who can activate the Kundalini within you so that you can go ever deeper into the truth of who you are.
Gabriel, thank you so much. That's such a great note to end on. I so appreciate you coming on the show. Savannah listeners, let me know what you thought of this week's episode. Thank you as always for your encouragement, for your feedback. And remember that nothing means more to me and supports the show than a review here on iTunes, even if iTunes isn't how you normally listen to the show. So a review is really the easiest way to give back, and also let me know the topics and the speakers that you care most about. My goal, as always, is to make this podcast everything you want it to be. Thrilled to be on this journey together. Thank you so much for being here. From Gabriel and I, from our hearts to yours, namaste.
You've been listening to the Savannah Podcast. To find out more about Savannah, go to savannahspirit.com or follow Savannah on Facebook at facebook.com/Savannah Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savannaeast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Savannah Podcast.